Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be going through your Edexcel B Geography Paper 2, the paper that we've written for 2024. So I want you to pay attention to the structure of the answers, how we've laid this out, and then what sort of things the examiner might be looking
for. Question 1, Part A. Identify which of these is not a sedimentary rock for 1 mark. The correct answer here is the fourth option, slate. Part B. Using figure 1 below, identify which of the following is the most likely reason for the landscape shown, for 1 mark. The correct answer here is the fourth option, lateral erosion through river processes. Part C. Explain one impact of urban settlements on the landscape of the UK for 2 marks. To achieve the 2 marks, you will first of all need to identify an impact and then give some supporting detail linked to the question. One impact here might relate to the growth of settlements in upland areas as a result of tourism and an increasing number of people being able to work from home. A feature of these settlements is congestion on narrow roads as well as poor parking, both of which impact the landscape. A second impact might relate to the increased number of impermeable surfaces, which impacts groundwater flow and surface runoff. Finally, a third impact might relate to increased noise and air pollution from settlements and associated roadways. Writing the second of these points up, our answer might read that one impact is increased surface water runoff that has resulted from the increased amount of impermeable surfaces, such as roads and houses, which impacts water flow in the area. This would be awarded 2 marks, as an impact has been identified and then supporting detail provided. Question 2, Part A. Identify what type of wave has a short frequency for 1 mark. The correct answer here is constructive. This will be sufficient to get you the mark. Part B. Name one example of a hard resistant rock for 1 mark. The correct answer here would either be chalk or limestone. This again is sufficient to get you the mark. Part C. Explain how a spit is formed for 2 marks. This question requires you to identify a valid way in which a spit is formed and then provide supporting detail. A possible response might read that a spit is formed during the process of longshore drift, where there is a change in direction of a coastline or when the sea is shallower, causing sediment to be trapped and deposited. This builds up a spit over time. This answer would be awarded 2 marks, as it identifies a cause and then provides supporting detail. Part D. Explain how the landform seen in Figure 2 was formed for 4 marks. This question requires you to identify 2 examples in the image given and then provide supporting detail to explain their formation. Looking at the image, we can see a cave, an arch, a stack, and a stump, all of which represent different points in the erosion of hard rock along a coastline. A possible response explaining this formation might read that these erosional features are found along a headland where there is a hard, resistant rock. It starts with a crack forming in the rock due to hydraulic action. This weakens the rock, and over time the crack gets bigger and bigger, forming a cave. The rock around is unstable, and the cave gets bigger still, forming an arch. Hydraulic action then widens the base of the arch, and the rock above becomes unstable. Finally, the arch collapses, leaving a stack which erodes into a stump. This question would be awarded 4 marks, as it explains in detail the formation of this landform using appropriate geographical terminology. Question 3, Part A. Identify the correct term for confluence for 1 mark. The correct answer is the fourth option, the point where 2 rivers join. Part B. Explain why the river channel is shallow in Figure 3 for 2 marks. This question requires you first of all to identify a reason and then provide supporting detail. A possible response to this question might start off by identifying the reason that this is the upper course of the river and it is yet to join with its tributaries. It might then go on to provide supporting detail that reads, therefore it does not have the power to erode laterally and erodes vertically, resulting in a narrow and shallow channel with the material being large as it has not been eroded. Part C. Explain how interlocking spurs are formed for 4 marks. A response to this question will need to identify 2 examples and give supporting detail for each. A possible answer might then read that interlocking spurs are found on the upper course of a river, where the erosion is vertical due to the river discharge being lower. With less erosional energy, the river is unable to go straight through hills and mountains, and instead must take an alternative route, winding around the areas of resistant rock which is harder to erode. This creates the interlocking spurs, which look like the teeth of a zip. This answer would be awarded 4 marks, as 2 examples are identified and supporting detail is provided for each. Question 4. Analyse the images in figures 4, 5 and 6. Studying the images, we can see that we have 3 coastal scenes, all showing signs of erosion. The information provided about the geology of each location suggests the presence of a less resistant rock. The exposure of this rock to destructive waves on areas of the coastline where there is high fetch would explain this erosion. Studying images 4 and 5, we can see signs of mass movement. Figure 5 in particular shows a bench positioned right on the edge of the cliff. In addition, there are no signs of coastal management at either of these locations. Figure 6, on the other hand, shows management strategies in place, with a sea wall and groins clearly visible. Pictured also is maintenance work being carried out on these defences. One final point to note is the information provided about the population for each of the locations. Looking at the figures, Hornsea has the higher population. This might suggest a greater need to defend this area of coastline, which in turn might explain why sea defences are evident at this location and not in the other 2. Assess the influence of geology on the land use and management of the UK's coastline for 8 marks. This question requires a developed response that is balanced and includes connected statements. Addressing the focus of this question, a top-level response will look to make links between the hard engineering and managed retreat visible in the previous images. Possible response might therefore read that the reason for the coastal erosion visible in all 3 areas is the geology of less resistant sedimentary rocks, which are more susceptible to erosion and weathering. Such rock, when exposed to the relentless action of destructive waves, especially in areas with a high fetch, undergoes rapid erosion. This is evident in Figure 4, which shows mass movement. Figure 5 shows a similar scene, as well as a bench just above where the cliff is collapsing. Management strategies used along the coastline are influenced by land use and population density. For instance, Happisburgh, with its less visible coastal defences, contrasts sharply with Hornsea, where substantial sea walls and groins are evident. These differences are likely due to the respective population densities and economic value of the land. Hornsea's extensive hard engineering efforts, including groin repair, suggest the area's high value and the necessity to protect it from erosion. On the other hand, the lack of management at Happisburgh suggests a strategy of managed retreat, possibly due to its lower population and economic value. This answer would demonstrate the requirements of a top-level response, as it includes geographical knowledge and makes use of the examples given. It also responds fully to the question, making links between the geology of the different locations and the information provided about population with the land use and management strategies employed. Question 5. Study figures 7 and 8. Figure 7 shows a light industrial unit in Leeds Central Business District, while Figure 8 shows the number of light industrial units in different regions of the UK. Part A. Identify one negative impact of empty units for 1 mark. The correct answer here is the final option, an increase in antisocial crime. Part B. Calculate the percentage decrease of units in the north of England. Give your answer to 1 decimal place. You must show your working in the space below for 2 marks. As indicated by the question, the first mark available here is for your calculation, while the second mark is for getting the correct answer to 1 decimal place. Using figure 8 as the source of our data, we need the number of units in the north of England. This therefore comprises Yorkshire, the North East and the North West. The first step in our calculation is going to be to work out the number of units in the north of England in 2016, so adding up the figures for Yorkshire, the North East and the North West for this year. This gives us a total of 56,520. We then need to calculate the number of units in 2023. So again, adding the figures for this year for Yorkshire, the North East and the North West, which gives us a total of 48,821. The second step in our calculation is going to be to work out the difference between 2023 and 2016. So subtracting the figure for 2023 from that for 2016, which gives us a total of 7,699. Finally, the third step is to work out this decrease in the number of units as a percentage. We need to do this by dividing the difference by the original amount and then timesing by 100. This is therefore 7,699 divided by 56,520 times 100, which gives us an answer to 1 decimal place of 13.6%. Part C. State 2 reasons as to why industrial units, like that in Figure 7, are seeing a decline in numbers since 2020 for 2 marks. 2 valid reasons here might include globalisation and the shift for outsourcing of manufacturing, and the fact that land use is more expensive in central business district areas, and therefore land is sold to be redeveloped. Part D. Explain one impact of the rise of quaternary employment in the UK for 2 marks. For this question, you first of all need to identify the impact and then provide supporting detail. A possible response might be that one impact is investment in new technology. The supporting detail for this would be such as super speed broadband to increase competitiveness with other regions and internationally. This brings the multiplier effect by encouraging other countries to establish a higher skilled workforce. Question 6, Part A. Identify which of these is not a consequence of studentification for 1 mark. The correct answer here is the second option. The number of sport and recreation facilities are reduced in the area. Part B. State one economic opportunity from rural diversification for 1 mark. There are a number of possible options that you could write here, including farm shops, accommodation, leisure activities, tourism, or educational activities. Part C. Explain one reason why counter-urbanisation is increasing for 2 marks. This question requires you to first of all identify a reason and then give supporting detail. One possible reason for this might be that house prices in suburban areas have increased dramatically. The supporting detail for this would be that it affects the affordability of homes and causes people to look to buy elsewhere. Alternatively, you might identify as a reason improvements in broadband, which has allowed more people to work from home, especially post-pandemic. Part D. For a named UK city, explain how regeneration impacts on the existing residents in an area for 4 marks. For this question, you should aim to identify 2 impacts and provide supporting detail for each. A possible response might read, that regeneration, such as that within Holbeck and Granary Wharf in Leeds, has had positive impacts. For example, residents have seen improvement in access to public transport and improved green spaces, as seen around Candle House. Another impact is improved housing that has resulted from regenerating run-down, derelict housing and redeveloping it into the Mustard Wharf development, agreed in 2018 and costing £55 million. This includes 250 new homes comprising 1 to 3 bedroom apartments, with a 2-bedroom apartment costing around £1,400 per month to rent. This will create a multiplier effect, as the additional 9,000 square metres of office space will attract workers to the area who will require services such as coffee shops and food outlets. This answer would be awarded 4 marks, as it identifies positive impacts of regeneration and gives supporting detail to explain how this affects residents. Figure 9 shows electric bikes in Leeds. For a named UK city, explain how urban sustainability can improve the quality of life. Again, in response to this question, you should aim to identify 2 different examples and give supporting detail for each. A possible response might read that cities around the UK have introduced a range of strategies to reduce the impact of congestion and encourage a shift to public transport. Integrated transport strategies, such as the London and Leeds City bike schemes, are electric bikes that can be hired at a range of places. This allows an integrated transport strategy as it joins different methods together. Another strategy is the expansion of green urban spaces, such as the new Air Park Inner City. By expanding parklands, it improves the air quality in inner city areas such as Holbeck. This answer would be awarded 4 marks, as 2 strategies are identified, with supporting detail included that also makes reference to a named UK city. Question 7. Analyse figures 10 and 11. Figure 10 is a table which shows the total number of the UK's population who have a first language other than English per 100,000 people. The first point to notice is that Polish is the most spoken language amongst people who do not have English as their first language in both 2011 and 2021. A second point to note relates to the collection of languages originating in South Asia, Punjabi, Urdu, Bengali and Gujarati, the figures for which are fairly stable between 2011 and 2021, with not much change. Arabic, on the other hand, has seen a considerable increase, with 28% more people speaking it as their first language in 2021 compared to 2011. A further point to note is that all other Chinese languages is the only listing in this table that sees a decrease in the number of speakers between 2011 and 2021. Finally, there are 2 other European languages listed, Portuguese and Spanish, both of which only see a slight increase in the time period identified. Figure 11 reads that London has always been a mixed ethnic city, but now has further expanded, with over 40% of the residents born abroad, according to the 2021 census, including almost 28% born to a non-European country. Migrants are mostly aged under 30, with London often being the first place they settle in. London has distinct areas of ethnic groups. For example, the Bangladeshi community remains concentrated around Bethnal Green and Whitechapel, and is spread into other East London boroughs. Another example is Polish, Poland being the most common European country of birth, with the boroughs of Ealing and Enfield having significant numbers of Poles living there. Assess the possible causes and consequences of these migration patterns for 8 marks, plus 4 marks spelling, punctuation and grammar, and use of terminology. This question requires a balanced and developed answer with connected statements. Considering the points made in relation to Figure 10, there are a number of possible causes we might identify to explain these migration patterns. The first set of data we are given is from 2011, when Britain was still part of the European Union, a key feature of which was freedom of movement. Government policy also encouraged the migration of workers from the EU. As a result, there had been a large amount of migration, especially from countries in Eastern Europe such as Poland. By 2021, Britain was no longer part of the European Union, with Brexit having come into effect in 2020. As a result, there were barriers to movement, and so migration from Europe slowed. Figure 11 helps identify some possible consequences of these migration patterns. First of all, we have increased cultural and ethnic diversity. However, with such a wide range of languages spoken, it does impose higher costs for translation services. Figure 11 focuses in particular on the impact on London, which does appear to be disproportionately affected in relation to the rest of the UK. A possible response to this question might then read that in 2011 Britain was part of the European Union, which allowed free movement of workers within its borders. In addition, government policy encouraged the migration of both skilled and unskilled workers from the EU to fill shortages. Hence, there was a high amount of migration of people from other EU countries, such as Poland, Spain and Portugal, as evidenced by these languages being among the highest spoken by people in the UK who do not have English as a first language. By 2021, however, the UK was no longer part of the EU. This made migration more difficult, and so fewer migrants from these countries arrived in the UK. This means a slower rate of growth of people who speak a European language as their first language compared to previously. In comparison to the European languages, there has been a higher growth in the number of people speaking Arabic as their first language. This could be due to conflict within the region causing people to leave, as well as the UK government's move to improve relations with the countries in the Middle East, to improve trade and facilitate access to resources there. This first part of the answer demonstrates the requirements of a top-level response, as causes are suggested and then links made to the data given in Figure 10. Continuing with the remainder of the answer, the consequences of these migration patterns have been increased ethnic and cultural diversity. For example, the UK population can now experience different food cuisines. However, there have been some negative impacts. For instance, with such a wide range of languages to accommodate, there has been higher costs for translation services to allow access to healthcare, education and legal services. In addition, since the UK left the EU, there has been an increase in illegal migration, which has created political conflict with other European countries. Finally, the impact of migration is felt disproportionately throughout the country, with London experiencing a higher amount than the rest of the UK. This part of the answer deals with the consequences of migration, a number of which are identified and then explained using examples. Question 8. Study Figure 12, which shows photographs of the two beaches chosen by a group of students studying the impact of coastal management processes at two different locations. The students have selected two contrasting locations. They're going to investigate the beach profile and the management. They are spending 2 hours at each location. Part A. Explain one possible reason as to why the students have selected these two locations for 2 marks. This question requires you to first of all identify a reason and then provide some supporting detail. Possible responses might include that it is due to contrasting landforms. Location A is a headland, whereas location B is suggestive of a concordant coastline. Or it might be due to coastal management. Location B is clearly managed, whereas location A is not. Both these responses would be awarded 2 marks, as they identify a reason and then provide supporting detail from the locations. Part B. Suggest one quantitative and one qualitative data collection method that would be appropriate for these locations for 4 marks. This question requires you to first of all identify a method and then provide supporting detail. It is important that you ensure your answer includes one quantitative and one qualitative method. Possible quantitative methods might include beach sediment analysis, for example, the Powers scale of roundness and fine sediment analysis. Or it might be beach profiling, selecting 3 locations and using ranging poles, clinometer and tape to measure gradient, or conducting a grid count of species or looking at water content. Qualitative methods, on the other hand, might include annotated field sketches, annotated photographs, or questionnaires or informal interviews based on set questions. Part C. Suggest how secondary data could be used to support the student's investigation for 4 marks. To achieve full marks on this question, you need to identify at least 2 different methods and give some supporting detail for each. Possible responses here might include geology or historic ordnance survey maps to identify the rate of erosion, or using house prices to identify areas where management is more likely, as higher prices would suggest more protection. Or a third option might be to look at car park use to determine how many visitors there are and so how attractive the beach is. Part D. You have carried out your own fieldwork investigating how and why coastal management impacts coastal processes. First of all, you need to name your coastal fieldwork location, and then assess the strengths and weaknesses of the methods that you use to collect your primary data for 8 marks. To achieve a top-level response for this question, you need to ensure that you write a detailed and balanced answer with connected statements. It is important that in your answer, you include both strengths and weaknesses of the methods you used, with examples and explanations given. Your response here will obviously be dependent on the methods that you used for your fieldwork investigation, but possible strengths might include that you used more than one location to enable comparison between the 2 sites, that you also looked for similarities between the 2 sites, for example, wide beaches, presence of shingle, access points and footpath, and your strengths in carrying out beach profiling to identify trends. Weaknesses, on the other hand, might include that the locations were accessed at different times, which could lead to different weather conditions and different points in the tide cycle, all of which might impact the results that you got. You might also have found access difficult for all students in your group. For example, you might have needed permission from a landowner. Question 9. Study Figure 13, which shows photographs of the 2 rivers chosen by a group of students studying the impact of river management on river processes at 2 different locations. The students have selected 2 contrasting locations. They're going to investigate how the characteristics of the river at each location impact the river management needs. They are spending 2 hours at each location. Part A. Explain one reason why the students have selected these 2 locations for 2 marks. This question requires you to first of all identify a reason and then give detail from the 2 locations. Possible points to include here might be that contrasting locations on the river course have been chosen, or that location A has clear management compared to location B which does not. Part B. Suggest one quantitative and one qualitative data collection method that would be appropriate for these locations. This question requires you to first of all identify a method and give supporting detail. It is important that you include both a quantitative and a qualitative method. A possible quantitative method might be to measure river depth. This could be done by placing a meter ruler into the river at a series of different points, adding the depths together and then dividing by the number of readings to give you an average. Another method might be to measure sediment size and type, using Power's scale of roundness or fine sediment analysis. You might also measure flow speed and map the river profile. Qualitative methods, on the other hand, might include annotated field sketches, annotated photographs, or conducting a questionnaire or interview based on a set number of questions. Part C. Suggest how secondary data could be used to support the student's investigation for 4 marks. To achieve full marks on this question, you should aim to identify at least 2 methods and give some supporting detail for each. Possible responses here might include the use of geology or historic ordnance survey maps to identify the rate of erosion, or you might use a flood risk map from the Environment Agency, or a gauge map to trace the river downstream looking at the risks of flooding. Part D. You have carried out your own fieldwork, investigating how and why drainage basin and channel characteristics influence the flood risk for people and property along a river in the UK. You first of all need to name your river fieldwork location, and then assess the strengths and weaknesses of the methods that you use to collect your primary data for 8 marks. To achieve a top-level response for this question, your answer needs to be detailed and balanced with connected statements. You also need to ensure that your answer includes both strengths and weaknesses, with examples and explanations given. Your response here will obviously depend on the investigation that you conducted, but possible strengths of the methods you used might include that you chose more than one location so that you were able to make a comparison. You might also consider the similarities of the sites chosen, for example, sediment materials, the river course, the profile of the floodplain, an access point and flood paths. You might also include the benefits of conducting sediment analysis, which allows trends to be identified. Your weaknesses, on the other hand, might include changing river discharge and access, the different times at which the locations were accessed and the impact this might have had, and also variable weather conditions at the sites. Question 10. You have carried out your own fieldwork investigating environmental quality in an urban area. You first of all need to name your urban area. Part A. Explain one quantitative method used in your fieldwork to measure the quality of life for 2 marks. This question requires you to first of all identify a valid quantitative method and then provide some detail about its use. Possible responses might include an environmental survey or recording noise, pollution, traffic, pedestrian counts. Part B. Using an annotated diagram, show one way in which you presented your qualitative data to explain your results for 4 marks. To achieve full marks on this question, you need to ensure that you are including a recognisable presentation of a graph or annotated diagram with a brief explanation of how you used it. One example might be the presentation of an environmental quality survey as a bipolar graph. Here you would be awarded the marks for a recognisable graph, and then there is some brief explanation provided underneath it in terms of how it was used. Alternatively, you might choose to present your findings as a stack bar graph. Again, this would be a recognisable graph with a brief explanation provided underneath as to how it was used. A final example is to use proportionate symbols. Again, a recognisable diagram with a brief explanation provided underneath in terms of how it was used. Part C. Explain the role of secondary data in your inquiry for 4 marks. To achieve full marks on this question, you need to ensure that you're including at least 2 examples with detail. In your response, you must include the use of census data. The second data source would have been set by your school, and it might include house prices, TripAdvisor reviews, or health data. A suggested response making use of the sensor data as an example might give some detail by saying that it is vital for gathering supportive points to prove and disprove literary information about the situation. It allows us to contrast and compare areas of the primary data collected. Part D. A set of students visited 2 contrasting areas of Leeds. One site was Bramhope on the urban-rural fringe, and the other site was Armley, an area of inner city. The distance between the 2 locations was 7.5 miles. The students collected a range of data, including a traffic count and an environmental quality survey, as well as taking photographs. They spent 30 minutes in each location, with 20 minutes dedicated to the traffic count. Reviewing the data for Bramhope, we can see both domestic and retail properties pictured. There is a narrow road with a single yellow line and parking on one side. Looking at the environmental quality survey, we can see that Bramhope consistently scores well. Looking at the image for Armley, we again have both domestic and retail properties pictured, with domestic properties appearing to take the form of flats in a tower block. On the road, we can see that there are vehicles parked on either side. Reviewing the environmental quality survey for Armley, we can see that the area consistently scores poorly. Finally, considering the traffic results for both locations, we can see that Armley has considerable higher volume of traffic than Bramhope. The students concluded that the environmental conditions in the urban areas have significant differences between them. Assess the evidence for this conclusion for 8 marks. Your response to this question will need to be balanced and developed with connected statements. In assessing the conclusion reached and the use of evidence, you need to ensure that you are using the data provided and considering the strengths and weaknesses of its collection. Possible points to include in your answer might be that the images of both locations show narrow roads. The Bramhope image shows single yellow lines with parking all located on one side. The traffic data shows that the car is the highest frequency vehicle, with very few larger vehicles passing. The total amount of vehicles passing in the 20 minutes was considerably less than in Armley, 32 vehicles in Bramhope compared to 146 in Armley. Furthermore, Bramhope consistently scores well on its environmental quality survey, achieving 2s for congestion, building quality, noise and overcrowding, and 1 for litter. The Armley data, however, shows the environment is significantly poorer, with 4.5 times higher vehicle traffic. In addition, the environmental survey shows congestion, noise and overcrowding scoring 3 points higher on ranking, with litter 4 times higher. The built environment surrounding Armley shows tower blocks and many parked cars. From this, you can conclude that the areas do have significant differences between them. The answer so far includes the requirements of a top-level response, as both locations are considered. The data has also been analysed and a conclusion reached. Supporting detail is also provided. The remainder of the answer then goes on to consider the limitations of the data. However, it is important to note possible shortcomings in the data used for comparison. For instance, the 2 locations might have been assessed at different times of the day. This could have a significant impact on traffic count and congestion. Moreover, only 1 traffic count was taken at each location for 30 minutes, which cannot be deemed representative of a whole day. It is therefore important that the students also use secondary data that might be available to either reinforce or qualify conclusions drawn from their primary data. Question 11. You have carried out your own fieldwork investigating how and why deprivation varies within rural areas in the UK. First of all, you need to name your rural area. Part A. Explain one quantitative method used in your fieldwork to measure the quality of life for 2 marks. This question requires you first of all to identify a valid quantitative method and then give some detail of its use. Possible methods to include in your response might be an environmental survey, it might be recording noise, pollution, traffic or pedestrian counts. Part B. Using an annotated diagram, show one way in which you presented your qualitative data to explain your results for 4 marks. To achieve full marks on this question, you need to ensure that you are including a recognisable presentation of a graph or annotated diagram with a brief explanation of how you used it. One example might be the presentation of an environmental quality survey as a bipolar graph. Here you would be awarded the marks for a recognisable graph, and then there is some brief explanation provided underneath it in terms of how it was used. Alternatively, you might choose to present your findings as a stack bar graph. Again, this would be a recognisable graph with a brief explanation provided underneath as to how it was used. A final example is to use proportionate symbols. Again, a recognisable diagram with a brief explanation provided underneath in terms of how it was used. Part C. Explain the role of secondary data in your inquiry for 4 marks. To achieve full marks on this question, you need to ensure that you're including at least 2 examples with detail. In your response, you must include the use of census data. The second data source would have been set by your school, and it might include house prices, TripAdvisor reviews, or health data. A suggested response making use of the census data as an example might give some detail by saying that it is vital for gathering supported points to prove and disprove literary information about the situation. It allows us to contrast and compare areas of the primary data collected. Part D. A set of students visited 2 contrasting rural areas within 40 miles of Leeds. One site was Grassington and the other was Masham. The distance between the 2 locations was 26 miles. The students collected a range of data, including a traffic count and an environmental quality survey, as well as taking photographs. They spent 30 minutes in each location, with 20 minutes dedicated to the traffic count. Reviewing the data for Grassington, we can see from the images that there is a narrow road with double yellow lines on either side and parking on the pavements. The environmental quality survey shows that it scores poorly for congestion, with mid-range scores for the remaining categories. The images for Masham show us the Black Sheep Brewery, with a car park possibly containing both workers and tourist cars. The environmental quality survey shows poor scores for noise and congestion, with mid-range scores for the remaining categories. Looking at the traffic results for Grassington, we can see that more cars were counted in the 20 minutes. This might be as Grassington is a village focused on tourism. Masham, on the other hand, has a higher amount of vans or lorries passing through, which again is perhaps not surprising when we consider that this is a site of production. The students concluded that the environmental conditions in the rural areas had significant differences between them. Assess the evidence for this conclusion for 8 marks. A top-level response to this question will ensure a balanced and developed answer with connected statements. You will need to ensure that you consider the data presented to you, as well as possible limitations with its collection. A possible response might include the following points. The image of Grassington shows double yellow lines with cars parking on pavements. The traffic data shows that cars are the most frequently occurring vehicles, with very few larger vehicles. Masham's data, on the other hand, shows that it has significantly more lorries and vans, which in turn will pollute the atmosphere. This might be linked to the brewery, which of course will be transporting their goods from production. This is supported by the environmental quality survey, with Masham scoring a 4 for noise. Apart from vehicle type and noise, the rest of the data for the 2 locations is very similar. For example, they both score 5 for congestion, 3 for overcrowding, and either 2 or 3 for the remaining categories of litter and building quality. From this, you can conclude that the areas do not have significantly different environmental conditions. This answer so far demonstrates the requirements of a top-level response, as both locations are considered. The data provided has also been analysed and a conclusion reached. Supporting detail from the data is included. The remainder of the answer then considers and explains the possible limitations. It is important to note possible shortcomings in the data used for comparison. For instance, the 2 locations might have been assessed at different times of the day. This could have a significant impact on traffic count and congestion. Moreover, only 1 traffic count was taken at each location for 30 minutes, which cannot be deemed representative of a whole day. It is therefore important that the students also use secondary data that might be available to either reinforce or qualify conclusions drawn from their primary data.
Ouch! This is when some videos I'll explain scratches.